it used to seem to me that the meaning of life was the question. And I think that's not the case, really. It's the meaning of existence. Because life actually is not that important on a grand scheme of things. And that's a hard thing to accept. But speaking from the vantage point of the sciences and cosmology in particular, life actually is incredibly unimportant. So there is a little narrative that we can tell that will explain just how unimportant life is. And then after maybe I say that story, I'll say something about why I think this is important. But the idea is that when we confront our own mortality, we very often confront death in terms of the death of the other. In fact, that's the only way to actually experience death. If death really is an end, it's not even really an end, because an end is something where you're doing something, you come to an end and you say, this is the end. You can reflect back on it and say, that chapter is closing. But if death is just non-existence, there is no end to reflect on. It's the unthinkable. It's that the abyss that's not even an abyss, because that's something. It's you can't even conceptualize your own death, which means that our only real experience of death is the death of the other. So our first experience of death is through mourning. The people that you know who are going to die, you see them come to an end, and you can experience that. And the rest is extrapolation for yourself. When you realize that everybody you love is going to die, and that everyone who loves you is going to die, that's heavy. And then you see, I'm part of that. I'm going to die as well. And a lot of people see that as the big existential moment. But the truth is that everything is going to die. And when you realize that everything is going to die, and then reflect on it from a grand scheme, you see how life was not so important to begin with. So, you and I will be dead within a century. That's for sure. And everybody that you've ever known will be as well. And it's probably the case that the human species is going to die out, because most species don't last that long. We haven't been around for that long either, depending on where you want to draw the break, maybe 5 million, 6 million years, something like that. But for sure, whatever we are as a species will die out. Even if through some fake belief in technology, because technology saves everything, right? We believe somehow we can escape that. The Earth is going to die. The Earth itself. And it may die soon from global warming and all the other garbage that we're doing to it, but it will literally be gone in about 5 to 6 billion years, because that's when our sun's going to die. Our sun's going to run out of fuel at that point, about 5 to 6 billion years from now. And when it does, the two forces that are balancing it, there's a force of the nuclear fusion explosion that's pushing it out, but a gravitational force that's pushing it in, keeping it a stable size right now, that the forces pushing out are going to overwhelm that gravity, so it's going to start swelling, and it'll become what's called a red giant. And when our sun starts to become a red giant, it will grow in size. It will engulf Mercury. It gets so big. It will grow so big that it will engulf Venus. And eventually, it will completely engulf the Earth. That is, the Earth will disappear. And then, before it gets out to Mars, it'll cool down and start to contract again. The Earth is completely gone at this point. And as the sun continues to contract, it just dies out like a smoldering ember. And any possibility of life anywhere in the solar system is gone. That's a very short time from now, 5 to 6 billion years. But every single star is going to die as well. Every single star within 100 trillion years from now, every single star in the universe will die, because they all have a lifespan. And when all of those stars die, all of that light energy, life-producing energy, dies with it. Life itself will most likely come to an end at that point. But even if there's some versions of life that can figure out how to sustain themselves without any stars around, it gets worse than that. Because if you look at 10 to the 36th power years from now, that's a really, really long time, like 10 trillion years from now, that's when matter itself starts to die. So protons have a lifespan. They will decay in 10 to the 36 years. And even though it's a long time from now, matter itself will start to break down. So even if there are things around that are alive, the basic building blocks that make them up will be gone. Now that's a long time from now, But the story of the universe continues on from there, because the story is not over. At this point, what will have happened is that there are going to be supermassive black holes, which we believe are at the center of almost all galaxies right now. Excuse me. And the Milky Way has one, the Andromeda has one, and we imagine that as these massive black holes begin vacuuming up all these dead stars and all these dead pieces of matter, that they'll sort of wander through the expanding universe, sucking up all these tiny little pieces of leftover things, vacuuming them up like massive leviathans, right, until there's nothing but these black holes. And at that point, about 10 to the 40th years from now, the only thing that will be around are black holes. Even all these little bits of matter will have been completely sucked up into them. The massive black holes will collide with each other eventually, forming supermassive black holes. So they're even eating each other up, so there are fewer and fewer and fewer things. You would think that would be the end of the story, but there's still a lot more exciting stuff to go on, because we know now that black holes actually leak. You think nothing can ever get out of a black hole, but because of some quantum weirdness, they do leak. Little by little, they give off tiny little bits of broken up matter. It's a very slow process, but every single black hole that's out there will eventually leak all of the matter that made it up. It'll spit it back out. That's going to take about 10 to the 67th power years. That's it's just unfathomable how long that time is. But about that time, right, one with 67 zeros after it, that many years from now, the final black holes will be spitting out the final little bits of matter that they had. When they do, they kind of pop at the very end. And they're going to give off a little bit of energy, a little bit of light as they pop, like a light bulb exploding at the very end. When the last one of these does that, that's the last light ever. For all time. Anywhere. At this point, the universe is so huge because it's expanding now, and it's not even expanding, it's accelerating expansion, so it's getting bigger and bigger. These tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces of broken matter are going to be so far from each other that there'll be no gravitational interaction whatsoever. They're going to cool to absolute zero, so they'll be giving off no radiation. They won't be moving, they won't be interacting, nothing will happen, and time itself will stop. That's about 10 to the 100th years from now. It's called the thermodynamic heat death of the universe. The point at which entropy reaches its maximum, the greatest state of disorder there is there, and everything is dead. Now, it's a long time from now. But what that really does is put everything into perspective. Because if you trace out this timeline of the universe, so right now the universe is about 13.7 billion years old from the Big Bang. 13.7 billion years out to 10 to the 100th power years. That's the lifespan of the universe. And you look at that timeline and you say, well, what was the era of life when things were alive? Not just you and me, but life in general. Because there's probably life out there. It'd be silly if there weren't life populating the galaxy everywhere. We tend to think, oh, that's what it's all about, life. But if you look at this timeline, there's a tiny little hash mark showing the era when life is even possible. Not your life and my life, but life in general. The whole story is not about that. That is a blip. It's an anomaly. It's a footnote to everything else that's going on. That life is not important at all. So that means that it's not just my life that I've got to worry about the meaning of, but it's within this context, life itself becomes utterly meaningless because it's this tiny little moment. So that, I think, becomes the question, explaining why all of this, and remembering that lifeism, that is, thinking that life is super important, is just another terribleism. It's racism, sexism, all those other things where you just tend to think, well, I'm the center of everything. I must use myself as a model for everything. Lifeism is maybe the last one that we've got to get rid of. Maybe lifeism shouldn't be the basis of our ethics. Maybe it's not only things that are alive that matter morally. Maybe lifeism shouldn't be used to found philosophy, to found cosmology, physics in general, because the universe is not all about that. I listened to that story, and I can't help but see it as a kind of depressing story. To think that none of this really means anything in the big scheme of things. But I know that's more just a character thing, the depression part. That's the story as it stands.
I don't think I ever want to become your friend.